All right, so today we're going to kind of dive into something pretty heavy. The question of whether Peter Dutton is fit to lead Australia. With the 2025 election coming up, we're looking at some articles and analyses that raise some serious concerns about his suitability for the top job. And we want to be clear, this isn't about gossip or anything like that. It's about, really trying to understand what kind of leader he might be. And we can do that by looking at, some of his past actions and statements.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes this deep dive so interesting is that we're not just looking at, a few isolated incidents. It seems like there's actually a pattern of behavior here stretching back over decades. And that's what's really concerning. So these sources suggest a tendency towards, inflammatory remarks, questionable financial decisions, and a real pattern of kind of attacking those who challenge him.
Yeah, when I was going through these articles, I was really struck by just how often these controversies kind of pop up. It's not just a one-off thing. It seems like, a recurring theme throughout his career.
Yeah, and it's that consistency that really raises concerns. And,
Yeah.
it's not limited to just one area. We see it in, his handling of asylum seekers and refugees, his interactions with the media, and even his dealings with colleagues.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out to me was that comment he made about a journalist, where he accidentally texted her, calling her a mad fang witch. And then there was that whole situation where he seemed to imply that a disabled political opponent was using her disability as an excuse not to move into his electorate.
Yeah, and these incidents aren't just about bad manners or anything like that. I think they potentially reveal something deeper about his character and judgment, this tendency to resort to personal attacks, and lack of empathy for those who are different from him. And, these are qualities that voters should really consider when deciding who they want as their prime minister.
Yeah, and let's not forget his time as immigration minister. That period was marked by some pretty harsh policies and some really dehumanizing language when talking about asylum seekers.
Yeah, the case of the Bilola family is a really illuminating example. His use of the term anchor baby and his really persistent attempts to deport the family, despite a young child being medically evacuated from detention, that sparked outrage
Hmm.
and raised questions about his capacity for compassion.
Yeah, I remember that case. I remember that case generating a lot of debate at the time. Some people argued that his tough stance was necessary to deter people smuggling, while others felt it was really inhumane and went against our values as Australians. I think it definitely brings up some important questions about how he might approach complex issues if he becomes prime minister.
Absolutely. And, I think the Bilola family case wasn't just about, one family. It was kind of a microcosm of his overall approach to immigration and border security. So, I think understanding his handling of this specific situation can give voters some real insight into his broader political ideology and how he might govern if elected.
It's not just about his words and actions towards asylum seekers either. There are some serious questions about his financial dealings and integrity that we need to unpack.
Yeah, several sources detail instances where his management of government funds and contracts raised some serious red flags. One example that really stands out is that $82 million meal plan for 209 asylum seekers. That works out to like a shocking $1,400 per person per day.
Well, $1,400 a day just for food. That seems excessive. Even if you factor in, logistical challenges, that number is really hard to justify.
Exactly. And it raises serious concerns about his judgment, his ability to manage taxpayer money effectively, and whether his priorities are really aligned with the needs of everyday Australians.
Yeah, one thing I found really frustrating while reading through these sources
Yeah.
was how he responds to criticism.
Yeah.
It seems like he deflects and blames others rather than taking responsibility. It's always the media's fault, or he's been taken out of context, or someone has a vendetta against him.
Yeah, that lack of accountability is concerning. It's essential for a leader, especially someone who's seeking to be prime minister, to be able to acknowledge their mistakes and learn from them and demonstrate a willingness to change. And, based on what we've seen, Dutton's consistent deflection and blame shifting doesn't really inspire confidence in his ability to do so. It's not just financial management where these concerns come up either. I think when we look at his attitude towards the media, a similar pattern emerges.
Yeah, you're right. His relationship with the press seems pretty adversarial. He really seems to dislike anyone who scrutinizes him
Hmm.
and often resorts to, attacking and trying to discredit journalists who dare to question him.
And it's worth noting that, a healthy democracy requires a free and independent press. So a
Yeah.
leader who's constantly attacking and undermining the media is essentially eroding one of the pillars of our democratic system.
Yeah, I remember reading about him calling journalists from outlets like the ABC, Guardian, and Huffington Post crazy lefties. and saying that, they were completely dead to him. That's a pretty concerning statement, don't you think?
Absolutely. Those kinds of comments are deeply troubling. They suggest a real disdain for dissenting voices and a desire to kind of control the narrative. And it raises the question, how would he handle scrutiny and criticism as prime minister?
And it's not just verbal attacks. There were those incidents where he seemed to use his position to try and silence critics and suppress unfavorable stories.
Yeah, the raids on journalist Annika Smethurst's home and the ABC headquarters come to mind. These actions really sent shockwaves through the Australian media landscape and raised serious concerns about press freedom under a potential Dutton government. It's something that I think voters need to consider very carefully.
Yeah, those raids were definitely a controversial moment. It felt like a real overreach of power and a direct attack on press freedom. Do you think these incidents are indicative of how he might govern if he becomes prime minister?
Well, it's impossible to say for certain, but they certainly raise some valid concerns. These actions suggest a willingness to use his authority to target those who challenge him, which could have, significant implications for the health of our democracy.
And then there was that incident
Hmm.
where he used parliamentary privilege to accuse former Border Force Commissioner Roman Quidley of grooming a young woman.
Yes, that was a particularly concerning example. For those unfamiliar, parliamentary privilege essentially protects politicians from being sued for defamation for statements made in Parliament. And in this case, he used that protection to make a very serious allegation against someone who had fallen out of favor with him.
Yeah, it felt like a real misuse of power and an attempt to smear someone's reputation without facing any consequences.
Exactly. And it really speaks to a broader pattern of behavior that we've been discussing, this willingness to use his position to attack and discredit his opponents, even when those attacks may be unfounded.
So we've talked about, his treatment of refugees and asylum seekers,
Yeah.
his attitude towards the media, and his use of parliamentary privilege. What about his track record on human rights more broadly? Are there any kind of red flags there that voters should be aware of?
Yeah, his stance on Indigenous issues is definitely something worth examining. For example, his initial opposition to the apology to the stolen generations was a decision that alienated many Australians and raised concerns about his understanding of and sensitivity towards Indigenous history and culture.
Yeah, I remember that being a really significant moment in Australian history. For him to walk out during that apology sent a very strong message. Yeah. And not a positive one.
Yeah, it was a decision that many saw as deeply disrespectful and insensitive. And while he eventually apologized for that action, it took him 15 years to do so.
15 years, it does seem like a very delayed apology.
Yeah, and some would argue that his subsequent actions on Indigenous issues haven't really demonstrated a genuine commitment to reconciliation. For example, his opposition to the Voice to Parliament referendum was seen by many as prioritizing political strategy over meaningful dialogue about Indigenous recognition.
And then there was that whole backflip on the promise to hold another referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition if the Voice failed.
Yeah, that backflip further eroded trust and left many feeling really betrayed. It suggests a lack of genuine commitment to addressing the systemic injustices faced by Indigenous Australians and a real prioritization of political maneuvering over real progress.
So, we're seeing a pattern of behavior emerge here. A willingness to use inflammatory rhetoric, a disregard for accountability, a tendency to attack those who challenge him, and a questionable record on human rights. These are all really serious issues that voters should consider when making their decision in 2025.
Absolutely. I think it's crucial for voters to go beyond the surface and really delve into these deeper issues. Understanding a candidate's character, their values, and their approach to governing is essential for making an informed choice at the ballot box.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day news cycle. But it's moments like this, with an election looming, that we need to step back and really assess who we want leading our country.
Exactly. And that assessment should involve a careful examination of the candidates' records, their actions, and their demonstrated commitment to the values that underpin our society.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today talking about Peter Dutton, his actions, policies, controversies. But as we head into this 2025 election, I think the biggest question for voters is what kind of leader would he be?
Yeah, that's really the core issue, isn't it? And to understand that, I think we need to look beyond specific policies and kind of delve into, his character and temperament. Like, how does he handle pressure? How does he respond to challenges? These are the qualities that really define a leader.
Yeah, one thing that's come up again and again in these sources is this difficulty in taking responsibility. It seems like there's always an excuse, always someone else to blame.
Right. And a leader who can't acknowledge their mistakes and learn from them. They're unlikely to grow or evolve, and that lack of self-awareness, that can be a major liability in a position of power.
Yeah. It also makes it hard to trust, you know,
Yeah.
that they'll act in the best interests of the country rather than, just protecting themselves.
Exactly. Accountability and self-reflection. Those are essential qualities for anyone seeking to lead a nation. And based on what we've seen, those qualities seem to be lacking in Peter Dutton.
Another concerning pattern is this reliance on divisive rhetoric.
Yeah.
It just seems like he thrives on creating this kind of us versus them dynamic and often targets, vulnerable groups like refugees, Muslims, and indigenous Australians.
Yeah. And that type of leadership is incredibly dangerous. It erodes social cohesion, fuels prejudice, and ultimately weakens the fabric of our society. A strong leader should be a unifier, not a divider.
It feels like he's constantly searching for an enemy, someone to blame for the country's problems.
Right, that's a classic tactic used by authoritarian leaders throughout history. Create a sense of fear, and then present yourself as the strong man who can protect the people from the perceived threat.
Yeah, he definitely cultivates that tough guy persona. But I think true strength lies in compassion,
Mm.
empathy, and the ability to build bridges, not walls.
Exactly. A truly strong leader understands that leadership is not about dominance. It's about service. It's about listening to diverse perspectives, finding common ground, and working collaboratively to solve problems.
So as Australians get ready to vote in 2025, what should they, take away from all this,
Mm.
from this deep dive into Peter Dutton's record?
Well, I think the evidence we've seen paints a pretty troubling picture. A pattern of inflammatory rhetoric, a lack of accountability, a tendency to attack critics, and a questionable record on human rights. These are not qualities that we should be seeking in the person leading our nation.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider.
Hmm.
But ultimately, the choice is in the hands of the voters.
That's right. And it's a choice that should be made with, careful consideration and a clear understanding of what's at stake. The person we elect as prime minister will have a profound impact on the direction of our country.
Yeah, that's why these deep dives are so important. We need to go, beyond the headlines,
Yeah.
beyond the sound bites, and really examine, the candidates' records and their potential to lead.
Absolutely. Informed voters are the foundation of a healthy democracy. So, do your research, ask tough questions, make your voice heard. The future of Australia depends on it.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into Peter Dutton. Thanks for joining us. And we encourage you to keep exploring these issues and, have these conversations about the kind of leadership we want for our country.